Hi everyone and welcome back. In this video we'll be reading another chapter of Christopher Robin by Disney. Chapter 6. Christopher stared down at the pile of papers on the table in front of him. He had been working on them since the train pulled out of Victoria Station nearly 2 hours ago, and he was no closer to coming up with a solution than he had been before. His sleeves were pushed up to his elbows, his hair was disheveled, and he was pained by numerous paper cuts from the small pieces of colored paper he had ripped up and taped sporadically across the equations as he agonized over finding numbers that would keep his staff intact. Sighing, Christopher flipped over another piece of paper. This one had a list of employees' names typed on it. Looking over the list, he crossed off 2 names. In the margins, he wrote 17% and circled the number. His pen dug into the paper as he continued to circle the number over and over, and still over yet again. They weren't just names to him. He knew the 2 people he had just so callously crossed off. He knew their families, where they were from, what they liked to do for fun. He sighed again. "Do you always have a case with you?" Pooh's question jolted Christopher and forced him to refocus. He looked across the table at the bear. He had been sitting quietly, much to Christopher's surprise, since it had left London. He had spent most of the time staring out the window at the passing scenery. "My briefcase," Christopher clarified, pointing to the leather satchel propped open on the table. He nodded. "Most of the time, yes." Is it more important than a balloon?" Christopher asked. "It's more important than a balloon, yes," Christopher answered. Apparently the bear hadn't just been aimlessly staring at the window. Pooh nodded. "I see," he said. "So more like a blanket?" Christopher bit back a groan. Once again he found himself drawing a comparison between Pooh and Madeline as a younger child. The incessant questioning started off cute, but he knew it would quickly become a bit, monstrous. "Sure," he said, after pondering Pooh's query. More like a blanket. He hoped then, agreeing, he would put an end to the conversation. He was wrong. "What does it do?" Pooh asked, taking a closer look at the case. "It holds very important things," Christopher said, shut it with a thwack, before Pooh's prying paws found their way inside. "Do you mind amusing yourself for a minute? I have work to do." Turning his attention back to his papers, he was surprised to find that Pooh seemingly had listened to him. For a moment the train compartment was quiet, and then it wasn't. House, clouds, house, grass. Pooh's voice broke the silence. "Dog, more grass." Christopher sighed. "What are you doing?" he said, looking back up at the bear. Pooh was staring at the window again. "I'm playing a game," Pooh responded, not shifting his gaze. "It's called Say What You See." "Well, can you play it a little quieter, please?" Christopher asked. Once again he was surprised that Pooh seemed to listen, and that it grew quiet. But once again the peace of quiet didn't last. House, tree, grass. Pooh continued to list anything he saw through the train compartment's windows. He did, in his defense, do it a bit more quietly. Tree, pond, tree. I don't know what that is. Bush, a man, house. A part of Christopher, the part that felt the beginnings of a serious headache forming, wanted to snap at Pooh and tell him to just not speak. But another part of him knew it wasn't worth it. The bear was just being who he was, and he had told Pooh that he should be himself, so it didn't seem right to fight it. With a sigh, he pinched the bridge of his nose. He was just going to have to hope that the bear grew tired of his game sooner rather than later. Returning his attention to the papers in front of him, Christopher continued to run his calculations. He had at least another hour before they would reach Hartfield in success. If he worked hard enough, he could make some headway, he hoped. Fortunately, at least from Christopher's perspective, Pooh's game quickly tired the bear, and he fell asleep, leaving Christopher time to work uninterrupted. He sat hunched over his papers, furiously scribbling and calculating. He ran and reran numbers as scenarios. He analyzed the data this way and that, until he was sure his eyes were crossing. But by the time the train pulled into the station in Hartfield, there was a big red number 20 at the top of his papers. He had done it. It was at a terrible cost to some, but he had done what his boss had asked. Now he just had to get back to London and deliver the news. But first he needed to get Pooh back to the 100-acre wood. As the train let out a loud whistle and steam hissed from the engine car, Christopher picked up Pooh and put him over his shoulder. Grabbing the briefcase in his other hand, Christopher weaved his way back down the train car toward the door. To his surprise and Pooh's delight, the red balloon was still there. It had been left its string wedged between the door and the train's car side. Grabbing the string, Pooh let a happy shout. Christopher barely registered it. The drive from the station had always felt like forever to Christopher when he was younger. The anticipation of getting to the house and out into the woods had made the minutes pass as slowly as hours. Back then he had barely registered the passing countryside or the lovely homes that lined the way. There was only one house he wanted to see, only one wood he wanted to register. Oddly enough, he found, as the taxi meandered down the country roads, that he felt nearly the same way. His foot tapped against the floor and his knee bounced up and down. It had been years since he had visited the family country house. He couldn't help wondering what it would look like. Would it feel as big? Would the trees seem smaller? Had it aged the same way he had? The taxi turned out the drive and Christopher's heart began to beat faster. The trees on either side had grown tall and thick in his absence and now reached over the drive, making it feel as though they were passing through a tunnel. Then up ahead, Christopher saw a burst of light and the house came into view. Christopher's breath caught. The house hadn't changed. It was still stately and comfortable at the same time. The grounds were still manicured and the paint seemed fresh. If Christopher hadn't known better, he would have sworn that not a day had passed since he and his mother had visited the home after his father's death all those years ago. For a long moment he sat motionless in the back of the taxi. He knew he needed to get out, but a part of him didn't want to step outside and possibly ruin the illusion. He knew that things up close tended to look different than when viewed from afar. The house could be falling apart inside, or small cracks in the paint might be visible for all he knew. In the back of the cab, he could fool himself for a little while longer, but finally, with a sigh, he grabbed Pooh and the briefcase, paid the driver, and stepped out into the country air. Looking up at the far right window, he saw that the curtain had been pulled shut. Evelyn must have been using his parents' old room while she was there. Hoping that the sound of the departing taxi wouldn't alert her, Christopher quickly ducked around the side of the house. "Are we going in?" Pooh asked, pointing at the house as they made their way toward the backyard. Christopher put a finger to his lips and shook his head. "No," he whispered. "No, we must keep quiet, not let them see us." Passing under a window, Christopher ducked down. He motioned for Pooh to do the same. "Stay low," he added. Despite the warning, Pooh continued to walk normally. Unlike Christopher, the bear was small enough to pass right under the window unseen. But just because someone looking out couldn't see him, that didn't mean he didn't want to see in. Stopping at the next window, Pooh lifted himself up onto the tips of his paws and peered through the glass. "Who's that?" he asked. Whipping around, Christopher bit back a shout. "Pooh!" he hissed. "She can't be Pooh," the bear said, confusing the wonder with an answer. "I'm Pooh." Making his way back to the window, Christopher carefully peeked over the windowsill and into the room beyond. Evelyn was in the family room, arranging a bouquet of bright flowers in a vase. "That's Evelyn, my wife," he said softly. While he had just seen her a day ago, she somehow looked different. Happier, maybe. Or more content. "She looks very kind," Pooh observed. "She is," Christopher said, his gaze lingering on Evelyn as Pooh wandered to the next window. "And who is she?" Pooh asked. Christopher snapped to attention. Pooh had managed to pull himself up so that nearly half his body was above the windowsill, clearly visible to whomever was inside. Ducking back down, Christopher awkwardly hunched his way over and pulled the bear back over. But as he did so, he caught sight of his daughter, sitting in a chair far too large for her, surrounded by textbooks. Her expression was serious, her eyebrows furrowed in concentration as she tried to make sense of the books on her lap. "That's Madeline," he told Pooh, "my daughter." Pooh's expression brightened. "Could she come play with us?" he asked innocently. Shaking his head, Christopher moved away from the window so that he could stand up straight. "No," he answered, "she can't come." They weren't, he wanted to point out, playing, but arguing semantics with Pooh seemed a colossal waste of time. So instead he kept walking toward the back of the house. Pooh followed. Do you not like playing with her? Pooh asked as they walked. No, Christopher said, but she's very busy working right now. Pooh nodded. They stopped. He looked down at the case Christopher still had clutched in his hands, then back at the house. Does she have a briefcase like you? No, Christopher snapped, the response laced with more venom than he intended. Yes, his daughter was studious. No, they didn't play all the time. But did that mean she wasn't a normal kid? No, it most certainly did not. Taking a breath, Christopher quieted his inner rant. He knew he was being sensitive, but what did Pooh know about the real world anyway? As if to prove his point, Pooh held out his balloon. Do you think she'd like my red balloon? He asked. It might make her happy. Once more, Christopher's temper flared. This time, he didn't hold his thoughts inside. What is it with you and the balloon? He snapped angrily. Happiness isn't just in balloons. Madeline is happy, and I'm happy she's happy. Now come on, Pooh. But even as he spoke the words, Christopher knew it wasn't Pooh he was trying to convince. It was himself. Luckily, Christopher was saved from conducting further introspection by their arrival at the edge of the woods. The trees created a natural fence of sorts for the Robins' country house, their thick branches reaching out over the manicured lawn. In the summer, those branches provide shade for picnics, and in the fall, they blanketed the ground in brightly colored leaves. Christopher used to think of the area between the house and the woods as magical, the place where anything became possible. Disappearing into the woods as a child, Christopher could leave behind his worries and his fears and become the adventurous friend and hero he always wanted to be. Staring into the woods now, he was overcome with the same feeling of anticipation that he would get when he was a boy, just before he let the trees engulf him. Only now, there was a nervous and anxious energy to the anticipation he was feeling. Taking a deep breath, he plunged his way into the woods. Pooh followed. The path he had used to take was overgrown now, but he could still make it out under the decades' worth of decaying leaves. He smiled sadly. Even this place couldn't be saved from the effects of time. Neither bear nor man spoke much as they made their way deeper into the woods. Lost in their own thoughts, they watched as the sun filtered through the branches overhead, dappling the forest floor with light. Birds sang out and animals rustled among the leaves. It was peaceful, and for just a moment Christopher felt some of the weight on his shoulders lift. And then they arrived at the old tree with the hollowed-out trunk. While everything else seemed bigger and older and more weather-worn to Christopher, the tree appeared unchanged. The bark was still the same rough gray, and his initials carved into the tree's side so many years ago were still there. The C and R sported a blocky and childish appearance. Reaching out, Christopher ran his hand over the bark fondly. Then he sighed. Well, Pooh, he said to his friend, I got you home. Pooh cocked his head. Aren't you coming with me? He asked. I can't, Christopher said. I have to go back to London. But I need your help, Pooh protested. I've lost all of my friends. He looked up at Christopher. He really didn't understand this new version of his old friend. His old friend would never have left him alone. His old friend would have loved the red balloon. His old friend would have been excited to go on an adventure. This new Christopher was no fun at all. Pooh sighed. He missed his old friend, Christopher Robin. Ignoring the sign, Christopher shrugged. Perhaps they're back now, he said, though he knew he didn't sound very convincing. And you could tell them all about your adventures. I would like to do that, Pooh said, nodding. Then off you go, Christopher said. Pooh hesitated for a moment. He wanted to say more, perhaps change Christopher's mind, but the man was already looking at his watch and tapping his foot in anticipation of leaving. So instead, Pooh wrapped his arms around Christopher's legs and hugged him hard. Goodbye, Christopher Robin, he said, squeezing it tighter. The gesture caught Christopher off guard. Awkwardly, he reached down and patted Pooh on the back. Goodbye, Pooh, he said. They nudged him toward the hole in the tree's trunk, his beloved red balloon trailing behind him. Without another word, Pooh ducked down and disappeared inside. Christopher let out a sigh of relief, his duty done. Now he could go back to the city and focus on his work. But as he turned to go, he caught sight of Pooh's red balloon. It was floating in the entry to the door. Moving down, he peered inside the large hole in the base of the tree. Pooh was in front of the green door that Christopher had always used to enter their special spot in the 100-acre wood. The bear was just crouched down, not moving. "What are you doing, Pooh?" Christopher asked, confused. Who would have thought the bear would have been eager to get through the door and back home? Pooh looked over his shoulder at Christopher. "Sometimes, if I am going somewhere and I wait, somewhere comes to me." "Right," Christopher said, trying to wrap his head around the bear's somewhat cryptic response. Then he let out another sigh. He really didn't have time to dilly-dally. He had to get back to the station and catch the next train home to London. He pushed himself back so he was once again in the opening of the tree trunk. "Well, good luck with everything," he said. That was a terribly unhelpful thing to say, but it was all he could think of. Pooh didn't bother to even look at him when he responded. "I will need good luck," he said. The answer sounded even sadder in the hollowed-out tree trunk, "for I am a bear of very little brain." "Yes, Christopher stammered, not sure what to say to that. "Well, goodbye," he finally said again, and crawled completely out of the tree. As he stood up, he hit the red balloon, which was still floating near the door. He shoved it into the hole. Once more he started to walk away, and once more he couldn't help pausing to look over his shoulder. The red balloon was still floating in the air in front of the entrance to the green door. Pooh still hadn't gone through. Guilt enveloped Christopher. He knew that if he were to leave now, Winnie the Pooh would just sit there, and sit there, and sit there some more, hoping that somewhere would come to him. But Christopher knew that that would never happen. And he couldn't just leave the bear there. Pooh was his friend, and he had tracked him down all the way to London. He needed his help. Christopher took a deep breath. Work would have to wait. Right now he had a friend who needed to get home, and he wasn't going to abandon him. Not again. Christopher hoisted his briefcase and put it on his arm. "Look out, Pooh," he said, ducking back into the tree. "Here I come." Christopher Robin was going back to the 100-acre wood. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for the next chapter. See you next time.